Okay, give me the signal. Good afternoon, evening, ladies and gentlemen. Whatever time you're tuning in the program called What's Going On PlantTalkRadio.com. I'm George Moss, the host of the program, and we are doing an abbreviated version of our regular program. We normally come to you from 2 o'clock to 3, but because at the time this will be airing, I'll be in Africa, I'm going to be taping a series of programs before I leave, just to make sure that we are here at least in a time slot, at least for a period of time, so that we can bring you the program in its natural airing time, at least partially. So from this point, for the next 30 minutes, we'll be with you, and we hope you'll stay tuned into the program, and we will have your attention for the next 30 minutes. Since I'm in Africa, while this is being aired, I won't really know how it came out myself. I'll be 2,000 miles away, and I plan to visit about 4 or 5 countries. I've changed some of my itinerary because there's some problems that they have with Ebola in some parts of Africa. So I won't call the names of any countries out, but there are some countries that I'm now going to have to change the plans that I had when I go to West Africa, and will not be going to a few of those nations I initially planned to visit. We'll though stop off in my usual starting point in Africa, West Africa, and that will be a combination of Senegal and Gambia, and then from there I'll figure it out once I arrive on the continent, and then I'll have to listen to reports and therein make the rest of my itinerary on the spot. Normally I try to spend about 3 weeks in Africa. That won't change in terms of how long I'll be gone, but we have enough programs that we've actually put in storage so that we can have them aired in our absence, and we'll be back here on the date starting again in the first of next month, since this is being aired in the month of August. So glad to have you as always, and we hope you will get something out of the program. Since we are dealing with my travel, and this is an annualized thing that goes on every year, and it's gone on since 2006, and because the Gambian government was good enough to give me a 5-year visa that doesn't expire until 2015, I'll use it 1 more year, which will be next year, and then I will begin to plan some travels elsewhere and do reports when I get back from those particular places as well. I have a burning desire to go to Britain and France, because I want to see those museums I've never seen. Just read about them, the Louvre in Paris, and of course the British Museum, that one of the largest museums in the world. And I want to go to the 3rd floor of that museum and look at some of the artifacts that are from ancient Egypt, which is one of my amateur specialties. And I want to see some of the monuments to verify things that I read about, and that I want to get some concrete information directly from the monuments themselves, particularly some of the hieroglyphs that are on some of the stones that have been taken from Egypt into the British Museum. So that is part of the itinerary for the month of August, and in the future we'll be preparing some travels elsewhere. I try to travel outside the country, and whenever I go outside, I come back with a renewed admiration for the United States, because of the fact that the United States is not just a place, but it's also an idea, and you run into that when you go outside the country, because they are actually thinking of the United States in terms of the ideals that the country stands for. And so we think of the United States in terms of the geographical boundaries, and of course that is the way nations are thought of. But there's something unique about the United States in terms of it is the only nation where there is an idea of that people have of this country that goes outside of the U.S., to which they are emulating some of the ideals that were incubated and created here, and they're now adopting those ideas where they are, to their benefit, by the way, and they are, many of them are taken off because they've adopted such things as capitalism, which was a grounding point of understanding this country by the book put out in 1776 by Adam Smith, called The Wealth of Nations. And that book, of course, was talking about the fact that in the past, nations had accumulated wealth by conquest. But in terms of the development of capitalism, what you have is wealth being created by production. And that was something that was new in the world, and we had not seen that before. And Adam Smith was writing about that at the foundational points of the United States. And that is germane because of the fact that we come together on July the 4th, which is to celebrate what occurred in 1776 in terms of the Revolutionary War that was fought, so that our forefathers could bring forth upon this continent a new nation conceived of liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, which is what Lincoln was talking about in 1863. So the idea of the country is what you run into when you leave the country and go outside, and you begin to get some sense of how the country is seen as great by those who've never been to the country, and you have to go outside to really appreciate the way the country is viewed by those who would like to be a part of this experiment, but are not able to be a part of it because of the location of their own habitats. But they speak very in laudatory terms about the United States. It's not the image that you get in terms of everyone on the outside of the country having a negative view of the United States. You run into a lot of people who marvel, who want to know about how things go here. And some of the most interesting discussion we'll have are those that want to come here but would like to do it the right way, and of course they're not living in proximity to the countries such as these countries that are around the United States. And so they would have to come through the immigration circuitry and would not be able to circumvent it as so many people are doing in terms of coming from the South into the country. But you get a lot of questions in your discussions with people abroad about how things are here and how can they in fact do the paperwork to arrive on these shores. And I think that those that would not understand what this country offers would be better served to go outside to see how the country is seen by others, so that they can gain a greater appreciation of how it should be viewed by themselves here. Because it's just like a building in some sense. If you are right next to the building trying to look up at the number of floors the building has, you can't see how tall it is because you're too close to it. And sometimes in terms of things, you have to get away from it, back from it, so as to be able to judge its height and the greatness of its buildings, its structure. And when you're too close, you can't do that. You go outside and you see from a distance how it looks, not only through your own eyes, but how it looks through the eyes of others. And as you begin to have a collage of views that are a collage of all the views you run into, plus what you see in your own view of it from outside, you see how great things are. Since I'm in West Africa, this is being aired, I want to read something that I read before from a book written by the great Thomas Sowell. And of course you have to read all of Sowell's books because each one goes into something that is just, he's a prolific writer in a lot of different areas. And his books on history, although it's not considered to be a history book as such, but when he writes about historical events, he brings a clarity to it that you will not find in very many other books written by other authors. And so this book, which I read from before, called Black Rednecks and White Liberals. And this book by Thomas Sowell I'll read from on page 111 in chapter 4, because it makes a point that we tend not to understand as well as we should about the history of slavery, since we associate slavery with Africa rather than associating slavery with the universal places where it was found throughout history. We think of it as a westernized and a specifically induced event in the continent of Africa, excuse me, to the exclusion of all of the other groups. And that is a fallacious assumption, that is a fallacious notion that has been incubated for too long, and that idea needs to go the way of be thrown in the dustbins of history, because it is a fallacious point of view that cannot be sustained by the historical record. One of the best polemics I've read on slavery and the universal and universality of the application of that institution, which is worldwide in scope, was in the chapter written by Thomas Sowell called The Real History of Slavery. And I don't think this point is unique itself. It's the way he expresses it that makes it unique. But he's not the only one that is in fact saying that slavery was a universal institution practiced on all continents, basically by with the people being enslaved that were most vulnerable around the people that were the enslavers. Some of the things we look at is slavery is that which we associate with the slave trade, where we're now seeing something different in slavery. That is the slave of persons from a distance, away from where the persons themselves were inhabitants. That would be something that when travel was more people were more mobile. Then, of course, the slavery can now become continental. It's no longer continentally grounded, but continents can now engage in slavery from other continents because of the mode of transportation and things that's been improved. But here's what Thomas Sowell says on page 111, and I think that this is the centerpiece of how we must begin to think of institutional slavery. He says slavery was an evil of greater, and I'm going to put my glasses on here because if I don't have my glasses on, I don't have the radar that bats have, so I have to. I can see clearly now. The rain is gone. Slavery was an evil of greater scope and magnitude than most people imagine, and as a result, its place in history is radically different from the way it is usually portrayed. Mention slavery, and immediately the image that arises is that of Africans and their descendants enslaved by Europeans and their descendants in the southern United States, or at most Africans enslaved by Europeans in the Western Hemisphere. No other historic horror is so narrowly constructed. No one thinks of war, famine, or decimating epidemics in such localized terms. These are afflictions that have been suffered by the entire human race all over the planet. And so was slavery. Had slavery been limited to one race in one country during 3 centuries, its tragedies, and this is a very key point, would not have been 1/10 the magnitude that they were in fact. And I'll pause here to say that that is a point that is made even to the, if you limit it to just the enslavement that took place with people in the continent of Africa. Because on page 105 of George Yete's book, George Yete being a historian from Ghana, who has a book out called Africa Unchained, and has 4 major books. He's written some other things as well, but there are 4 major books he's written, one of which is called Africa Unchained. On page 105 of that book, He talks about the slave trade of those that were on the continent of Africa that were taken to the eastern part of the world, taken east, not west. And he talks about the horrors and also the numbers, 20 million he estimates it to have been, that were taken to the eastern part of the world, and talks about that slave trade that was much worse, but has not yet been given notoriety that the slave trade that has been pigeonholed as having occurred in the West has been given. But he would in fact endorse a view that's been given here by Thomas Sowell, who says that that those horrors that we focus on do not even amount to 1/10 of the horrors of slavery that was as an institution in history, in fact. Then he raised this question. I mean, he's talking about, history, which was Napoleon's point of view, that history is a fable agreed upon. So now he raises the question, after having said that the focal point is upon slavery that doesn't even account for more than 10% of the horrors that slavery was in fact. Then the question comes up then, why has that focus been so excellent in the writing of history? And this is the question that he raises about that. He says, why this provincial view of a worldwide evil? Often it is those who are most critical of a, quote, Eurocentric, unquote, view of the world, who are most Eurocentric when it comes to the evils and failings of the human race. What Sowell is saying there is the ones who would claim to be Afrocentric, the ones who would claim not to be Eurocentric in their outlook, are the ones who are most focusing on Europe as being the progenitors and the sole progenitors of slavery, and focusing solely there as if it happened nowhere else. Not only in terms of other people, but in terms of nowhere else, in terms of those on the continent of Africa. And what he's saying here is that without acknowledging that they have a Eurocentric view and claiming that their view is Afrocentric, it is a Eurocentric view. And that is a critical point that Sowell makes. I think he makes it to exclusion of others who have written on this subject. He calls that view Eurocentric and not Afrocentric. The further question to be asked here is the one that follows the question of why this provincial view of a worldwide phenomenon. And he follows that question up by asking, why would anyone wish to arbitrarily understate an evil that plagued mankind for 1,000 years, unless it was not the evil itself that was a real concern, but rather the present day uses of that historic evil? In other words, the politics in back of it needs to be looked at. And what are those politics are about?
You can't go to Italy and demand that the people who are now living in Italy will pay a big check for reparations for the deceased of the greatest development.
That's right. In other words, I usually right in the head with a sledgehammer. Because John, you figure this out. I wonder why other person can't figure this out. You figure this out. Well, you already knew about it. You didn't have to figure it out today, but you already knew. But it's not chemistry to figure this out in terms of the reason why it is kept into the provincial settings. West Europe and the United States and those places that would feel some guilt about it is because they are, like other parts of the world, are willing to write a check. And these college professors, that would be about tenure. You see, there's a guilt debt to be paid, and some of the scholarship that is lacking can be owed to the enslavement of black people, and therefore the scholarship, which should be on a certain level, is not on that level because how long were black people enslaved in this country? And that has lessened the amount of time that blacks have spent in the library because it was the cotton fields, and that therefore should give them a pass in terms of how we credit their work on a different level than the way it's credited with others who are writing in the scholarly domain.
I said, you know, we have the same problem that Nixon had, because they kept records of the corruption. The things they did.
That's exactly
Okay,
it.
that's what I did Nixon also.
Mhm.
See, on my knowledge, I don't know many African nations who had a system of writing, the history. I was mostly oral, if I'm not mistaken.
It was oral.
So, I mean, but the Romans and they wrote,
Mhm.
and the Greeks, they could write it down. The rules were basically the rules that the other cultures had in Europe, there's different forms of that. That were very, some of it was larger than that, there were people that still carry that system out. Basically, it was the ability to keep records that made us more dynamic.
Yeah, you see that, and you see that even in the literature. There are no slave records in West Africa written by slaves that were enslaved by the Arabized people on the continent of Africa, and also the Arabs that came in on the continent of Africa in 639, starting off in Egypt, going to Madrid, which would include Egypt and Libya, and one other country that's in the northern part. The one next to Libya would be, what is that, Tunisia. I think that's Tunisia next to Libya. And those nations where Islam comes on the continent of Africa, and it begins to, over a period of time, fuel the slave trade some 500 to 700 years before the slave trade we focus on, which is the slave trade involved in Europe. That slave trade would have brought a written script, Arabic, into West Africa. Before that, there was no written script in Africa. It does not mean there was no script on the continent of Africa. There were 6 scripts on the continent, but no written script as of that, the insurgency of Islam in the western part of Africa. They came from the eastern part of Africa and began to expand into the western shores. And so the oral tradition is one of the ways in which they maintain history through the word called griot, which is a French term, which means the oral historians, which would kind of musically sing the history and pass it down from one generation to another. And of course, it would be enhanced by the skills of the teller, and it would have some questions, but we can't say that when you write it, it doesn't have any bias or anything in it that doesn't add to the drama of the story. It goes both ways, and I don't dismiss it because it is oral, nor do I accept everything because it's written. And so the balance has to be understood in terms of how we see that which is oral and that which is written on history. But there are no slave narratives in the slavery that occurred, even in the Arab slavery, which tells us something about the horrific conditions of that slavery. Because we do have all kinds of records of the slavery that occurred in the United States, and no slavery is good. But let's not make the horrors one-sided to the point where we begin to see it as being that which occurred in one nation to exclusion of all the other nations, when the fact is that all nations have practiced it, and no people have been exempted from its. Many has been exempted from being its practitioner. So we have to be more universalist in our understanding of slavery. And I'll be going again to the home, the alleged home of the ancestors of Alex Haley. And I've been there. I was there in 2000 and I was there in 2007, and I'm going back again this year. But I don't think that what I read in Alex Haley's book called Roots can be sustained based upon going there and seeing the landscape myself, and now realizing that what is being described in that book, of course, cannot be true based upon just looking at the physicality of the environment described in ways which do not meet the what you see once you get there. And plus, Ellis was confused about how the slave trade played out. He had a misunderstanding of the slave trade, thinking it was Europeans going in the interior of Africa and grabbing people from the continent and putting them on boats. When that is a Western view of it, which is also distorted. There was no Europeans were not allowed in the interior. And when they tried to go in there, to some extent, on their own, because of the infectious diseases in Africa, the lifespan was like 11 months because of the lack of there was no inoculation against the different diseases in Africa that what they would have had in Europe or any population goes into another continent. If there's not the kind of inoculation that's in place, then that you can't go in there and then come out. And that's why they were saying that Africa at that point was a graveyard. But that's a distortion of how the slave trade played out, because Alice Hitler was not really he was not a historian, and he did not understand the distortion that he'd been given possibly in his history class that in his reading, and he didn't understand how the slave trade played out in Africa, thinking it was really where Europeans did all the work and Africans were the victims of the work done by Europeans. That's a misunderstanding of it. So he asked the question, why would anyone wish to arbitrarily understate an evil that plagued mankind for thousands of years, unless it was not this evil itself that was the real concern, but rather the present-day uses of that historic evil? Finally, he says, clearly, the ability to score ideological points against American society or Western civilization, or to induce guilt and thereby extract benefits, which is what John was saying a few minutes ago, from the white population today, are greatly enhanced by making enslavement appear to be a peculiarly American or a peculiarly white crime. And that is a distortion that needs to be addressed and changed, because we can't begin to get the healing in place and to get the facts corrected. And that's a very primordial fact that needs to be understood in order to change some of the discourse in the country, because the blame game is part of the things that are in fact hampering this country from going forward. And as long as you are pointing fingers as if someone is guilty to the exclusion of other groups, and there's somebody practice something that nobody else practiced, as long as that is the way we look at history in terms of the interaction between Africa and Europe, we'll never be able to bring about the racial healing we must have in the country. Those who would make the indictment make it out of their own ignorance, and those that accept the indictment, they also accept the indictment out of ignorance, because the facts do not allow for the conclusion to be made based upon an accurate assessment of history, that one group practiced something against another group and no one else was involved in it. In fact, the ending of slavery is a westernized construct, because once in the period in the Enlightenment period, once Europe had come to a different understanding of slavery and began to outlaw it in Europe, and the slave trade now being outlawed, it was not understood anywhere else in the world, and they began to challenge Europe in its beginning to put an end to this horrific institution that had been universal all over the world throughout the annals of history. Okay, well, we are in Africa as you listen to this production. Hope you will stay tuned to all the programs here at BlendTalkRadio.com as always, and we will see you when we get back. Hope you stay tuned until that time. Until next time, once you follow your dream, because don't forget, if you don't follow your dream, you'll never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.